The RTX 4090 is here, and as you're probably aware, it's pretty damn amazing, offering up one of the biggest generational leaps that we've seen for a very, very long time, and therefore allows Nvidia to keep hold of the crown as having the most powerful GPU on the planet right now. And with a ton of AIB cards on the market, I wanted to drill down a little bit more into the Gigabyte Gaming OC model. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits for my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32GB of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits, or if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver, thanks, but where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. And you call me the stupid one. Now, before we get started, if you saw our content from launch day, you'll be aware of kind of how the Gaming OC from Gigabyte performs. But with limited time, I kind of wanted to go into a bit more detail, which I guess brings us to today. Now, when looking for a new GPU, you often get a ton of choices from various brands. And then within them brands, you get a choice of various models. And normally with Gigabyte, we'd see an Eagle OC, Gaming OC, and of course, master models. And at the time of filming this, it seems like with the RTX 4090, Gigabyte are actually releasing around 11 models in total, from kind of all the way from the Wind Force all the way up to the Aorus Extreme Water Force model, with the Gaming OC, I guess, kind of sitting comfortably in the middle. And that's why I've, I guess, personally always liked the Gaming OC model. It, I guess, offers up that happy middle ground of features, design, performance, thermals, and acoustics, without breaking the bank too much over what would at least typically be an MSRP base card. So the first thing you'll notice with the RTX 4090 Gaming OC is that it has the essence of what we'd expect, with a few small tweaks on the design. Now with larger fans when compared to the previous generation, and what feels like a slightly more plasticky feeling to it. Maybe it's just me, or maybe it's a pre-production model, but the 3090 Ti Gaming OC that I actually have is, I don't know, just it feels a bit better in terms of the plastic used. Beyond that though, the key thing, like all 4090 models, is that the Gigabyte card is a beast in terms of size. I mean, it's a chunky boy, coming in at 340mm long, 165mm high, and 75mm thick. So the cooler actually protrudes beyond triple slot, while the I/O is actually only dual slot. Now the other key noticeable thing is that it weighs a lot, at 2,285 grams. But with any heavy product, that does actually make it feel a bit more solid. I just wish there was maybe some metal on the shroud, but I guess that's maybe what allows Gigabyte to potentially upsell customers to a master or an extreme base card. I still feel like you get decent value for money with this card, even though it's now coming in at $1,699, which is actually $100 over what the Founders Edition comes in at. Now I mentioned that the fans are larger, coming in at around 110mm, and they do include a different rotation on the middle fan compared to the two end ones to provide the very best cooling capability and to obviously reduce turbulence. Now there is a lot more RGB on the 4090 than maybe I would have first expected, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because it's around the fans and it can always be turned off. But what's interesting is that it can be maybe quite distracting by default, and it does actually ramp up based on the fan speed, which maybe some would see as a nice feature, but it isn't exactly subtle. But again, having the ability to change it or just completely turn it off within the Gigabyte RGB Fusion software kind of negates this whole issue. Now around the back, we find a full length backplate with a large cutout for heat to dissipate through from the extremely large finned heatsink, and it all feels very solid, but I'm not entirely sold on the color scheme. It's not the first time Gigabyte have used this color, which is kind of bluey green, but with the front of the card being black, it just feels a bit mismatched. Other than that, there's some large Gigabyte and GeForce RTX branding, which isn't too over the top or in your face. The only other branding on the whole card is on the top with another GeForce RTX branded wording and the Gigabyte RGB logo, which again can be controlled through software. But I don't actually mind this, it's kind of subtle and pretty typical of what we've come to expect from Gigabyte Gaming OC cards over the years. Also on the top is where we'll find our 16-pin power connector with those 4 sense pins. And yes, Gigabyte do actually include a 4x8 pin to 16-pin adapter cable, which won't melt. And if you have any fears on that, I suggest you watch our video with Johnny Guru that kind of goes through it in a lot more detail. It's also worth noting that due to the power limit of 450 watts on this card, you can actually run the adapter just using 3 of the 4 connectors with no issue whatsoever. And the 4th is more for cards that surpass the spec that's set out by Nvidia. Next to this is an OC/silent BIOS switch to flip between the 2 BIOS modes depending on your use case. And for all of our testing, we of course use the OC mode to maximise performance, as we'd expect any keen gamer to do so as well. The end of the card sees both the front and the back plate merge into each other, which again just looks a bit off due to the colouring to me, but does show us mounting holes for a support rail or the addition of fans or whatever you wanted to actually screw into it. On the opposite end with the I/O, as mentioned, it will take up 2 physical slots in your case, though the card protrudes much closer to 4 slots due to the large cooler. On the I/O we have some ventilation along with 3 DisplayPort 1.4a ports and a single HDMI 2.1a port, which is the same as what we saw on the Ampere based cards. Now taking the cooler apart and taking a closer look, and it's a pretty standard affair. We have quite a large shroud that wraps around the heatsink and has connections for the 3 fans along with the RGB rings, and a separate connector for the RGB Gigabyte logo on top of the plastic shroud. Moving on to the heatsink, it's a thick boy, and I think at this point is the largest I've seen on any gaming OC card, and it's the main reason why the RTX 4090 is so thick in the first place, though I've only had 2 RTX 4090s in my possession, so it's safe to say that all 4090s do actually have large coolers. So it's not like the Gaming OC is overly large when compared to the competition, though I am eager to see how it compares to other higher end models within Gigabyte's lineup, like the Master version, as you'd like to think that maybe that would have a superior cooling solution. The heatsink itself, which is made up from as many fins as they could physically fit in and comprises of a vapor chamber and heat pipe design. Now due to this, it's actually split into 2 large areas, which are separated between the 10 copper heat pipes, though only 8 of them stem from side to side, while 2 actually kind of loop back into the area around the copper plate that we'll call the GPU core. While the plate for the GPU is copper, the other surrounding cooling components look to be made from aluminium, including the various pieces of metal that will aid in keeping the memory and the VRMs under control. The backplate also appears to be made from aluminium and isn't the thickest I've ever seen, but is welcomed either way, as it will help in reducing sag by giving some strength to the PCB itself, and of course will assist in cooling as well. And that's evident from the thermal pads that sit between the backplate and the PCB itself to help the transfer of heat. There are a few cutouts which seem like they serve frankly no purpose other than for aesthetics, apart from the large cutout that I touched on earlier to help with airflow. Now the PCB is actually quite a bit smaller than what you'd expect, at 230mm long and 140mm in height. And straight away you'll see that the PCB itself is jam-packed full of components. Around the GPU core we find our Micron branded GDDR6X memory chips, of which Nvidia have clearly learnt the error of their ways, with all of them being on the front of the card. Now on both sides there are a ton of power stages, 20 in fact, to handle the GPU voltage, while there's another 4, one in each corner, to help manage memory voltage. So slightly up on the 3-phase design on the Founders Edition 4090 from Nvidia. At the top right of the PCB we see our 16-pin power connector, which as we know is rated for up to 600 watts of power draw, and scattered around the board are various connections for the triple fan cooler. For the specs of the card, Gigabyte have kept them the same as the Nvidia Founders Edition, which doesn't make complete sense to me as it's called the Gaming OC, but in theory should be able to boost for longer due to the cooling being much bigger and beefier than what's on the Founders Edition. For our testing, due to the nature of the card being so high end, we're going to focus on 4K testing, and we've tested 30 games in total, so a lot more than our original launch day coverage, which we'll cover when we look at the overall averages, which we'll also cover and have data at 1080p and 1440p for overall averages as well, just in case, people want to complain about that, as we saw from the original coverage. So what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of data to go through, and whilst we'll show as much as we can here today, the rest of that testing data will be put live for our Patreon members to look at, so definitely be sure to sign up and check that out for a better understanding. Now in terms of our test system, we tested everything using our Intel Core i9 12900K test system using the Asus Z690 Maximus Hero motherboard. We paired it with 32GB of Patriot Viper Venom 6200MHz memory, and resizable bar was enabled for all GPUs. All of our Nvidia based cards were tested using the latest 521.90 driver, while the AMD GPUs were tested using the latest 22.10.1 driver. And every test was run on the latest update of Windows 11. So starting things off with some Call of Duty Warzone, where we see a large 49% uplift in performance from the Ampere flagship 3090 Ti in the average FPS, with a smaller but still impressive 35% increase in the 1% lows. It'd be rude not to discuss Cyberpunk and the fact that the RTX 4090 can run it on ultra settings at 4K at a whopping 76 frames per second, which is a huge 41% uplift compared to the 3090 Ti Gaming OC, and a 68% performance improvement over the 6950 XT, making AMD look pretty terrible in comparison. In Stranding at 4K, we see a similar story with the RTX 4090 Gaming OC sitting 37% ahead of the 3090 Ti. And with the 6950 XT from Sapphire ahead of the 3090 Ti, it's still actually nowhere near the new Nvidia RTX 4090. Lastly, we see the RTX 4090 Gaming OC again with a huge leap in performance over the 3090 Ti by around 53%, and an even stronger lead of 63% over the 6950 XT, with the 1% lows suffering even more as the 4090 storms ahead of the 6950 XT by 77%. So that gives us just a sample of what the RTX 4090 is capable of. And if you want more, then we do actually have a lot more benchmarks over on our launch day coverage, as well as even more up on our Patreon for those who want to check that out. Now, what is interesting to look at is the overall averages across the 30 games we tested, starting with 1080p, where we see a decent 7% uplift in performance over the 6950 XT from Sapphire, which is nice to see. But it's much less than what you'd expect, and that all comes down to the fact that the 4090 is such a powerful card that it simply gets bottlenecked at 1080p. Moving up to 1440p, and we can see that performance gap getting larger with a 21% performance improvement over the 6950 XT, but it's still being limited by our processor even at this resolution. Then finally at 4K, we see the sheer performance of the Gigabyte RTX 4090, with an uplift of 42% over the 3090 Ti and a larger 47% gain over the Radeon 6950 XT, with the most interesting thing being the 1% lows, that are around the same as the overall average of both the 3090 Ti and the 6950 XT. Now that is some serious performance. Now, with the RTX 30 series being quite warm, especially the RTX 3090, which seemed to struggle with heat more due to the design choice of memory placement, we have to talk about heat. And to be fair, the Gaming OC does a pretty impressive job. We know that it has a lot more power in terms of physicality and in terms of performance, but it only manages to get around 2% warmer than the RTX 3090 Ti. So I'll chalk that up as a big win. More performance and less heat, but along with temperatures, we do have to talk about acoustics. And again, it's pretty decent. At 45.2 decibels during gaming, it is the loudest card that we've tested here today, but it's only less than 1 decibel more than the 3090 Ti Gaming OC, which I never really found to be overly loud anyway. Now, as you'd expect, during idle desktop work, the fans will completely shut off, and I'd assume that during gaming, you'd have headphones on, so it kind of becomes a bit of a moot point. So now the big one, and with all the talk of power before the launch being blown, frankly, entirely out of proportion, we actually see the RTX 4090 Gaming OC using around 14% less power overall when compared to the 3090 Ti. So I guess that kind of shocked everyone. So the Gigabyte RTX 4090 Gaming OC. From our extensive testing, it's definitely a huge contender, and just from some of the Facebook groups and our own Discord chatter, link is down below, that I've actually seen a lot of people have decided to plump for this particular model. Now, I know some people were dead set on it, while others resorted to actually getting it after seeing the price of some of the more exotic models from MSI and Asus, and not wanting to spend the extra, which actually made them go for this. And you know what? That's fine, because the Gaming OC has always been a product that aims for those kind of target customers. Gigabyte knows it's not the best on the market with this particular model, and I don't know, sometimes it's a little rough around the edges, but that's okay because it's generally reflected in the price. Now, obviously, I would have loved to have compared this to a Founders Edition from Nvidia, but they didn't send us one. So feel free to rant about that in the comments section or on Twitter. Not that I think they'd listen anyway. But with the same clock speed, it really comes, I guess, down to the cooler. And if you think it's worth the extra $100, and more importantly, because of how quickly all cards have gone out of stock, what you can get hold of at that particular time. Now, obviously with the Gaming OC, compared to the likes of an FE card, you do get a decent amount of RGB, which, while it doesn't add any extra performance, I know we all wish that it did, it may actually tie in better with the rest of your system compared to a Founders card, which, I don't know, kind of have to admit, looks a lot more business-like and less gamery. But really, I guess that comes down to personal preference. So all in all, I think if you bought any RTX 4090 right now, apart from the big hole that it would leave in your wallet, you're not going to be disappointed in the performance side of things. And the Gaming OC will just improve on that ever so slightly. I think most of the Gaming OC comes down to personal preference with predominantly the style, or if you're faced with it being the model that's most readily available, then maybe you won't really have much of a choice. But even then, it's not like it's a bad choice. Hopefully Gigabyte will send us some of their other cards, like the Master or the Waterblock versions in the future, and then that will allow us to do some fun comparisons there, especially with looking at value for money. We are also expecting some other models to come through from other brands, including getting the MSI Supreme X model back and some other cool models from various AIBs, including some more expensive but much more exotic models. So make sure you're subscribed for all that good stuff. That aside, hopefully you enjoyed this video. Hopefully it gave you a bit more of an idea about the Gaming OC and what Gigabyte actually have to offer, and less about the core itself. And if you did like it, then a like and a sub to this channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, consider supporting us over on Patreon, where you'll get access to a ton of cool features, including an upcoming live stream where more than likely I'm going to be answering a lot of questions about the 4090, as well as upcoming RDNA 3 GPUs and much, much more. If I don't see you there, then I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.